proposed public hearing on ordinance amending Title 20 of the BMC regarding cottage housing development, duplex and townhomes, bonus density for affordable housing development in definition updates. Mr. Jackson.
Thank you. And everybody see the screen I'm sharing?
Yes.
Okay. Excellent. Well, I know a lot of you have been looking forward to these missing middle housing updates, so I'm happy to be here tonight. These come straight out of our Infill Toolkit and address, as Council President said, duplex, townhome, cottage housing, and a density bonus. Our Infill Toolkit, the elongated name for that is the Assessment of Bremerton's Affordable Housing Policies and Regulations. For time-saving purposes, we call this the Infill Toolkit. It started in 2018 as an effort to identify, gaps in our regulations where we were inhibiting affordable housing. We have kind of a sister document to that we completed with Kitsap County, called the City of Bremerton and Kitsap County Affordable Housing Recommendations Report, and that was published in March of 2020. They identify all of the same kind of recommendations for tonight's proposal in that document as well. Kind of past success stories that the Planning Commission and City Council have passed out of this document of the Infill Toolkit. We raised the citywide minimum density to 6 dwelling units per acre. We relaxed regulations on accessory dwelling units to remove the owner-occupied requirement and permit 2 ADUs per property. We allowed for lot size averaging of subdivisions. Relaxed standards on manufactured homes. It used to be that our minimum lot size is 30 feet wide, but the minimum width we would require for manufactured homes was wider. So we changed that so it could fit on our minimum lot size or width. And we also updated the code to allow for duplexes and townhomes if you are within 500 feet of a commercial zone or center, and some others also, if you're interested. The current proposal for this evening is to permit duplexes and townhomes in the low density residential zone. It's the R10 zone. This would not increase density. It would just be an additional housing type allowed. To permit cottage housing in both the R10 and R18 zones, to permit an affordable housing density bonus, and that would be citywide, and some definition updates as well. So this gets at missing middle housing. As you can see in the picture there are, there's a lot of single family homes being developed, there's apartments being developed, but there aren't a lot of missing middle housing types being developed. The joint affordable housing document from the city and Kitsap County defines missing middle housing as medium density housing like duplexes, triplexes, townhomes, court style apartments, cottage clusters, or accessory dwelling units. And that they note that a lot of these housing types were largely outlawed in the post-war period in favor of single-family housing units. So first on the docket from our Infill Toolkit are allowing duplexes and townhomes in the low-density residential zone or R10 zone. So from a federal perspective, housing shortages are a nationwide problem. There is an administration announcement from the federal government which encourages these types of missing middle housing to address affordability. Specifically, they ask that we work, that they intend to work with state and local governments to boost housing supply by reducing exclusionary zoning. Now, this prohibiting of townhomes and duplexes would be an example of exclusionary zoning. And specifically, this document issued from the White House encourages development of 2 to 4 unit properties, particularly in low to moderate income communities and communities of color. At the state level, for the last several years, the state legislators have been promoting the idea of taking discretion away from local jurisdictions and mandating that all local jurisdictions allow duplexes, townhomes, and other missing middle housing in their single family residential zones. This hasn't passed, but it is a trend that we have seen from the state, providing direction to local jurisdictions on how to provide for that missing middle housing. Now, how this is being promoted at the county level, you've already seen this joint study produced by the city and the county that outlines strategies to achieve missing middle housing. And additionally, Kitsap County already allows these housing types within our urban growth areas. So urban growth areas are areas outside of city jurisdiction that are slated to one day be annexed by the city. These are areas that are allowed to have urban development, but they are not technically under city jurisdiction at this time. So in all of those zones, the yellow area is the urban low residential, urban restricted is the blue, urban medium is the orange, urban high is that gray color at the top, and they're commercial. They already permit or conditionally permit all of the housing types recommended here today for duplexes, townhomes, and cottage housing, so that our less urban neighbors are already promoting housing types that are more urban than the city. Locally, and I'm going to address these pictures here on the right-hand side before I talk through these code sections. Locally, we have support for these amendments also. That first picture there is a duplex, a couple of duplexes off of Lafayette. This backs up right against a Forest Ridge Park. This was a development of about 10 separate duplexes that were constructed in the early 2000s. That's before our zoning code changed to prohibit duplexes in this zone around 2004 and 5. So this is a attached single family home that's on High Avenue. It was constructed about 2018. Now, I think anybody passing by this home would look at this and think it's a duplex, but there's actually a property line running right through the middle of this structure. So that's what an attached single family home is. It means they share one common wall. But to anybody passing by on the street, they would assume that this is a duplex. Attached single family homes are allowed citywide. And lastly, this is a home with 2 accessory dwelling units currently being constructed on 13th Street by Bremerton High School. Once again, I believe anybody looking at this home would think that is a single family residence, when in fact, there are 3 separate dwelling units within that one structure. So going over to the code sections that are listed on this sheet, duplexes and townhomes are already an outright permitted use in the low density residential zone. but you need to be within 500 feet of a commercial district or center. We're proposing to remove that 500-foot prohibition. Townhomes are already an allowed use citywide if you go through a residential cluster development. So in the R10 zone, you can already develop townhomes if you go through a specialty subdivision called a residential cluster development. And as I had said before, attached single-family homes are already allowed throughout the R10 zone as well. And lastly, a primary residence with 2 accessory dwelling units with no owner-occupied requirement is already allowed any place in the city where a single-family home is permitted. I bring these examples up because there are many examples of essentially allowing the proposed development types of duplexes and townhomes already in the city code. This is a map of all of the existing non-conforming housing that is only in the R10 zone. So no other zones are the R10 zone, I would say, is pictured in that kind of yellowish color. And duplexes, triplexes, and apartment buildings are there in orange in the low density residential zone already. So we have a current prohibition on these uses, but as the zoning has changed over time, this leaves behind buildings and structures that are now prohibited in those zones, while duplexes, triplexes, and apartments are already prevalent throughout the R10 zone. So existing property sizes in the R10 zone. All of the green properties are in the R10 zone and are large enough to develop 4 dwelling units. So the reason why the 4 dwelling units is important here is because the city already allows for a primary residence and 2 ADUs. And it's in a pretty attractive development package. There's lower amounts of parking for an ADU, and you can develop an ADU on any sized lot. So because it's not subject to density requirements. So it is a more attractive option to develop a primary residence with 2 ADUs than it would be to develop a triplex. Even though both of those structures have 3 dwelling units, a triplex would require more parking and would be subject to density requirements. So you could not develop a triplex on any lot that you could develop an ADU on. So as you can see, there is kind of a trend that in the interior of the city and in existing neighborhoods, there would be much less of an impact because there is not a lot of lots that are large enough to support 4 or more dwelling units unless you're on the periphery of the city. So earlier this year, the Kitsap Association of Realtors hosted a Kitsap Housing Summit at the Convention Center downtown. And as you'll see in this graph here, that presentation noted that in the 20-year period from 1981 to 1999, that there was many more housing units produced than there were in the last 20 years from 2000 to 2020. And that has in part led us to the housing crisis that we find ourselves in now. As less housing units were developed, they became more scarce. And then that is leading to affordability problems. And particularly that the development of 2 and 4 unit and 5+ unit residential structures dropped. And a recommendation that came out of this study from KCAR at this housing summit was that single family parcels should be able to develop duplexes and triplexes to promote to promote affordable housing. All right, just a brief review of going over those many steps. Allowing for duplexes and townhomes in the low density residential zone is identified in our affordable housing strategy documents, both locally and from the joint document with Kitsap County. They are identified as affordable housing solutions at the federal, state, county, and local levels. They are currently permitted in the city with some prohibitions. And these development types are currently found everywhere throughout the R10 zone. And it may end up being a small impact because there aren't properties that are necessarily large enough for four dwelling units, but it does remove an existing prohibition that potentially inhibits affordable housing. And lastly, that it is a recommendation from the KCAR Housing Summit to allow for duplexes and triplexes in single family home zoning districts. Okay, so moving on to our next topic for cottage housing. This is also identified in the Infill Toolkit. Council is probably familiar with the subject. Having first seen this in February earlier this year, we came to council and got approval for a non-matching $40,000 grant to develop a cottage housing code. So staff has been going through that effort after receiving that grant, and this is the product. This will be presented by our planner, Kate Millward. She is a prized member of our planning group. Kate?
Thanks, Garrett. All right, so cottage housing is a development pattern that harkens back to a more traditional type of neighborhood on a smaller walkable scale. This is typically for more dwelling units that are clustered around a shared open space. So it's a common lawn, and it creates a pedestrian environment instead of an automobile-oriented environment. And these ordinances are typically accompanied by density bonuses, but that's not what we're proposing for our code. Next, please. We are proposing a definition of cottage housing development that means a lot containing more than one principal conventional dwelling unit. These units shall not be greater than 1,200 square feet and shall not share any common walls, ceilings, or floors with other principal conventional dwelling units. The development's orientation would propose that the structures are oriented to a street or shared open space and limited to clusters of no more than 12 units. That's fairly standard across other jurisdictions that we researched, that it's capped at 12 in order to maintain a community feel and neighborly atmosphere. Another proposed change is that each dwelling unit is required to have 400 square feet contributed to the shared open space. And finally, we're proposing a parking space requirement of 1.5 spaces per unit. Next, please. This type of development also comes with design standards. Typically, they incorporate a front porch, and that also supports the neighborliness and the community development aspect of this development type. So we're requiring a front porch with a minimum dimension of 6 feet depth and 10-foot length, so that to encourage the use. We're also proposing that an existing home that is not conforming to cottage housing standards may remain on the lot. And the procedure for this would be in low density residential zones, 3 or fewer units are already outright permitted when meeting all criteria of approval. For 4 or more units, we would require a conditional use permit. And then in the medium density residential zone, they're outright permitted when meeting all conditions of approval. Next, please.
Okay, thank you, Kate. And I'm just going to scroll back here really quick and say that this picture here is currently in the city of Bremerton on Snyder Avenue and is an example of cottage housing that we have right here in the city, if you're curious what that might look like. Okay, our next topic is a bonus density for religious organizations. So this is a mandate from the state of Washington that we provide a density bonus to religious organizations, specifically RCW 3670A 545. And that requires us to provide a density bonus, which is not defined on what it is, for religious organizations providing low-income housing, as long as all the residents are low income, that there be a time restriction, that the development is required to be exclusively for low-income housing for a period no shorter than 50 years, and that those religious organizations providing the housing are not allowed to discriminate against any person that qualifies as a member of a low-income household. Specifically, that portion reads that the affordable housing development does not discriminate against any person who qualifies as a member of a low-income household based on race, creed, color, national origin, sex, veteran or military status, sexual orientation, or mental or physical disability, or otherwise act in violation of the Federal Fair Housing Amendments Act of 1988. So we are proposing to extend this entitlement to the Bremerton Housing Authority. They have a sterling record of providing affordable housing throughout the city of Bremerton. We have a letter of support from the Bremerton Housing Authority that you'll see up there on the page now. If any council members would like a copy of that, I'd be happy to provide it. This would be applicable in all zones throughout the city that have a maximum density. Some densities in our city do not have, some zones in our city do not have a maximum density. So this would apply only to zones with a maximum density, and the proposal is for an increase of 50%. So once again, it would apply to religious organizations and the Bremerton Housing Authority. The procedure would in every case be a conditional use permit, and the criteria of approval beyond what is required from the state would be that they meet all other city requirements. So parking, utilities, traffic mitigation, etc. That it does not apply to congregate living facilities, that all units are affordable, that we would have them record a notice to title on the property, recognizing that it is required to have affordable housing for a 50-year period, and that they are required to consult with Kitsap Transit on any appropriate transit services that might be necessary. Okay, and the last modification for proposal, as we looked at allowing more compact development types, like duplexes and townhomes, we considered how that might work with our current definition of maximum density. So we currently get a lot of questions from customers who come to DCD and wonder how many units that you can build on their lot. And it's not a very plain spoken or common sense approach that we currently have. Currently, maximum density means the maximum number of dwellings allowed per the net buildable acre as stated for each zone. We're proposing to change that word net to gross, and for these reasons. A gross, so our example comes from the R10 zone. 1 acre equals the potential for 10 dwelling units. And that's how most people assume that it works when they're coming to the city. Oh, I have 1 acre. That means I can build 10 units. That's not how it works. So a net acre means that you would have to subtract any roads or easements or critical areas or critical area buffers from that overall parcel. And that the resulting amount of land, that is what you are allowed to have the number of units from. So this little pie chart here shows that 1 acre, but once you subtract, in this hypothetical scenario, 0.3 acres, you're left over with a much smaller piece, a 0.7 acre with 7 dwelling units instead of what you might assume would be 10. Now, as we're proposing more compact development types, it makes more sense to change this definition. When you're developing single family homes, as you might see in example 1, each one of those structures requires side yard setbacks and other setbacks from other structures. This means that single family homes require more area in order to develop them. They each have their own private driveway. They each have side yard setbacks that push those structures farther apart. Well, if we're considering allowing townhomes and duplexes, that is a much more compact development type that you can build in a smaller amount of land. So in example 2, we'll say that this is half an acre, and so you could develop a potential of 5 dwelling units. In example 2, if that lot is encumbered by a wetland or wetland buffer, utility easements, you might assume that you could build 5 dwelling units, and there's potentially room to build 5 dwelling units. But based off of our definition of net acre, you would only be able to build 2 dwelling units. So it's been challenging to explain to property owners over time how many dwelling units they could have based off of our current definition. And once again, with these more compact development types, it makes more sense than ever to change this definition. Okay, so we did a fair amount of public notice in regards to these amendments. We had several planning commission meetings, the first being in April. And then I presented these changes to the Kitsap Housing and Homelessness Coalition in May of this year. In particular, we chose that association because it includes the Bremerton Housing Association, Kitsap Community Resources, Housing Kitsap, and some other religious housing organizations as well. So this was the shortest route to getting in front of as many housing organizations as would be interested in this update. We provided an update to the Kitsap Building Association in July. The Planning Commission had a workshop in June and then a public hearing in July. The city sent out an e-news, that's Facebook, Twitter, and other electronic sources, September 2nd. A mailer was sent to religious organizations about the density bonus on September 2nd as well, and later emailed as well. This is the notice that we sent to the religious organizations. There's approximately 40 within the city. And we also sent out today and tomorrow. It was a little too big. It was about nearly 7,000 property owners. We sent out a mailer today and tomorrow to all property owners within the R10 and R18 zones for the current proposal. Now that included a kind of trifold document that you'll see up here on your screen. Once again, just kind of relaying what the proposed amendments were. And to get back in front of those housing organizations as well, on the day of the hearing, I'll be presenting to them to let them know that the hearing is that evening and providing them with an update from the last time that we met. So the Planning Commission unanimously recommended that the City Council hold an open record public hearing, consider testimony, and approve the proposed amendments. And staff is available for questions.
Thank you. Thank you for all the work you guys